Good evening, Dungeon Masters, I'm Baron Durop. Let's face it, the Fate Core RPG, while slim and elegant, does a really poor job of providing guidelines on how magic, psionics, or even superpowers might work in practice. While the concise explanations of dice rolls and the difficulty ladder are fine for skill checks we'd normally do in D&D anyway, like climbing a rope, the notion of using the same system for spellcasting, especially when coming from D&D's predefined leveled spell lists, can seem entirely foreign and almost impossible. But it doesn't have to be. It should come as little surprise that to cast a spell in any RPG, a character needs some sort of narrative excuse. In D&D, this almost always comes from a character's class, like Wizard, Cleric, or Warlock. In the Fate Core RPG, however, these narrative excuses manifest themselves in a much more free-form way, and almost always come about as aspects. As a low-effort example, a character's high-concept aspect might represent the sum of a D&D character's race, class, and background. Half-elf wizard hermit is an acceptable, if not unimaginative, high concept. But access to magic doesn't have to come from a high concept. The character could pick up an extra magic item with its own arcane imbuing aspects, like an enchanted brooch. Alternatively, this narrative excuse could even come from a character's trouble. Replicating the D&D Warlock's motif in the Fate Core RPG might be best done by granting a character some kind of trouble which demonstrates the unpredictable and wild relationship they have with an otherworldly dangerous entity. Thus, the very thing that gives a character their magic power might also prove to be the most haunting thing about them. With all this said, how do you actually cast the spells? To put it bluntly, we are both spoiled and creatively stunted by D&D's spell description lists. What was designed as a way to help players and dungeon masters stay honest with each other about a character's spellcasting power level, consequently robs us as RPG players of the ability to come up with our own free-form magical effects on the fly. Further, this creativity shunting consequence also eliminates a dungeon master's opportunity to gauge the true effectiveness of a player's would-be ad hoc spellcasting. Therefore, we have two problems we need to solve. How do we, as players, know what spells we can cast, and how do we, as game masters, judge the difficulty to cast that spell? To answer the first question, the types of spells a player can cast should be informed by their magic-granting aspect's theme. A good magic-imbuing aspect should have some sort of limiting or constraining motif that helps the player stay within some creative boundaries. This isn't to punish the player's creativity, but actually encourage it. These limitations serve as a storytelling tool. A divine messenger of the gods likely shouldn't have access to be able to summon demons from the abyss. Incidentally, these kinds of limitations are seen in D&D too, as per each class's spell list. Bards don't get access to Eldritch Blast for the exact same reason a Warlock doesn't get access to Revivify. At any rate, assuming a player has dreamed up a thematically appropriate magical effect, how do you know if a character can even cast it successfully? As a starting example, imagine a rather straightforward D&D spell, Firebolt, for example. A gout of flame shoots from the caster's hand and does an amount of damage roughly equal to a longbow. Therefore, the difficulty should be just like a longbow's attack. But what about something less straightforward, like climbing a sheer surface? In D&D, the heavy-handed cast of Spider Climb solves all of these kinds of problems, but is such heavy-handedness always so necessary? Climbing a cliff might not need a roll if a character had rope, a harness, and pythons, so how much more difficult would it be to make such a climb without those tools? That's probably how difficult this spell should be to cast. In essence, therefore, magic is just replacing physical components like tools and supplies, manpower, or even time, all which would be required to achieve the same outcomes through non-magical means. The more of these physical things that would be required to reach a spell's intended results non-magically, the more powerful the magic needs to be to make up that physical difference. If causing a rock slide to cut off an invading army might require a squad of sappers working around the clock for 3 days to place a series of explosives, the spell-like effects to reach this outcome would need to be extremely difficult to cast. All the digging, rigging, and dynamite needs to be replaced with magic. Interestingly though, and something that D&D entirely fails at, is that this difficulty versus power relationship can work both ways. In D&D, for example, summoning a demigod to your presence might require the use of an extremely powerful 9th level spell like Gate. So to calculate this unachievable feat in Fate Core, how would you create a wormhole connection between two universes? Cosmologists estimate opening a wormhole to another location might require the same energy a star outputs over a few million years. But what if a character could figure out how to sacrifice an entire star for the sake of the spell? Would this make the spell easier to cast? What about snuffing out a binary star system in a 2-year-long ritual involving the chance of an entire cult? Beelzebub might simply walk through the summoned portal, no difficulty roll required. For further interest, swapping one physical component of a mundane operation with an equally rare arcane one might be a good way to keep the spell thematically appropriate, but maintain the same difficulty of the task at hand. A pile of 1,000 corpses might be used by a necromancer to assemble a bone cottage over a few weeks of magical chanting, whereas, for comparison, a few contractors would be able to frame a similar structure by swapping the corpses for lumber and nails. It clearly takes some attempts to get your head around, but with some practice, you'll quickly learn how to consistently measure freeform magic difficulty on the fly. The last thing to touch on here is how spells can be used to create long-term enchantments or area effects. A Fate Core facsimile of Firebolt is easy enough to get your head around, but what about spells that charm or paralyze, or create explosions or fog banks in an area? All of this can and should be done by creating aspects. The trick is where to place them in play or on the character sheet. For a debilitating enchantment like causing paralysis, the targeted character should likely make a check to avoid taking an appropriate consequence. The more poorly they resist the magic, the more limp or stiff the consequence aspect makes them. Becoming charmed by a vampire's gaze could be a strategic problem, forcing players to decide when to accept various consequence compels and when to spend fate points to avoid them. For a fog bank, if the spell is successful, simply adding an aspect to a zone is fine enough. Once it's an aspect, players know that they and their opponents can invoke it to hide, for example. To replicate a spell like Fireball, simply create an aspect briefly affecting a zone with a nominal explosion, and ask all characters in those zones for physiques checks to avoid the stress and consequences. A good starting place to derive the target number to defend against spells like these could be to subtract the GM's minimum target number to cast the weakest version of a spell from the success level of the player's roll. If a minimum viable fireball requires a 2 on the ladder, and the player rolls a 6, then everyone in that zone might need to make a physique check of 4 or suffer consequences. Altogether, you don't need a set spell list or predefined spell levels for Magic and Fate Core. Lean into your character's magical aspect to justify your arcane usage, and measure each spell's casting difficulty by thinking through what physical aspects of the game world are being eschewed as a result of casting the spell. Thanks for watching, Dungeon Masters, and until next time, good night.